So let's recap value proposition just really quickly, okay? Just want to show you a couple examples and recap, because this is really the center point, and we've talked about how important it is. So remember, a value proposition gives the overall view of what our bundle products and services or solutions that we provide to the client. It's the sum of our benefits that we're promising to deliver in return for a payment. And we've talked about that in our business model, and you should have a thorough understanding of how that works. But let's look at a couple particular value proposition examples. So if you break down value propositions can basically be defined as different attributes that we're providing to a particular customer. And how we perform on these attributes actually give us different value. And we talked about this in a couple examples where some companies might compete in the same industry, but some companies might be awesome at attribute 1 and terrible at attribute 5. And another company might be terrible at attribute 1, but awesome at attribute 5. Does that mean that they're a good company or a bad company? No. It just means that they're providing different value to their customers and they compete differently. Sure, they might be offering value to a different target market or different segments, but that's fine, but they still can compete in the same industry. They just compete differently. But remember, the important thing here is that this set of attributes is really what makes different companies' value propositions. So really to illustrate that, if you look at this chart, for example, this looks at the overall cosmetics industry, and it compares it to a company called The Body Shop, and many of you guys probably have been to the mall store, The Body Shop, and it looks at what is their offering, how are they providing value to their customers. So if you look at the general cosmetics industry, so their pricing is higher, their packaging and advertising cost is high, they have high-tech science behind them, they really focus on their image and the glamour, right? So if you contrast that to The Body Shop is competing on different elements. They're offering a different value proposition to its customers. So they're lower in price, they don't spend as much in packaging, they're basically no thrills, they're not really pure high-tech and science-based. But what they do offer and how they're competing, they're offering natural ingredients, and they're really selling this lifestyle, this healthy way of living, right? So certain customers are going to value those attributes more so than the traditional cosmetics industry. That allows them to compete. So it's really a good contrast if you look at The Body Shop versus the general industry, because they've become successful by doing business a different way, by offering different values and actually different product attributes to its target customers. So here's another example of how this really works, and this is looking at circuses, and which just seems like a random example, but Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey just actually ended their, had a run for a very long time. They just closed down. But if you look at circuses, there used to be a lot of small regional circuses that would tour the world, and Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey was kind of the big king on the block, and so they were the big circus, that was the big three-wing circus that performed in different shows. And so if you look at value that they're offering versus the example here is Cirque du Soleil. So this business has been around for a long time, and typically how the industry would compete and the attributes it would compete on would be on low price, different types of performers, focus on animals. So you can see that there's different elements that they would compete on. So if you contrast that to Cirque du Soleil came in and offered a different value in the same type of entertainment, basically. So the big differences are in their attributes is they'd had higher price, but they didn't have stars, they didn't really have animals, they didn't have aisles, they kind of didn't travel around or go to multiple shows or different stadiums. They were located in one location, and in this case, I think they were in Las Vegas when they started, maybe in Europe, I'm not totally sure. But they still were, similar in terms of fun and humor and thrills and danger. But what they did is they had other elements that connected to people, and so that just was a different way of competing. So as we go through our cases through this class, I want you to take a look at how are these companies competing on what attributes. And when we talk about segmentation and positioning and we get into those elements of our cases, we'll really see how this really manifests in some case examples we show in terms of how companies are competing, and they're going to be competing on vastly different value propositions, but they're still having success. Okay, because value proposition is really important and a lot of people have a hard time really thoroughly understanding it, I'm kind of killing you guys with it, but So just want you to look at how value proposition intersects with different components of strategic elements of the company and operations level of the company. And I'm going to go through a couple quick examples and just to kind of give you just like the rest of the story for value proposition. Okay, so value proposition is a challenging topic for a lot of people. And again, going back to some examples. And so in an executive ed class that I have, might have like 35 executives from different companies, and we talk about value proposition. And I say, like, how many people can articulate what their value proposition? No, well, let me step back. So first I say, how many people can have a value proposition at their company? And sometimes there's people at the same company that are attending one of these classes, and almost everyone raises their hands. Yeah, we have a value proposition. And I say, okay, well, I want you to write down what your value proposition is. And the crazy thing is people have a super hard time doing this, and even if they're talking about a product set or a category at their company, but they have a hard time articulating the value proposition. And so this is surprising in a way that people should know, but I think people haven't really thought about it in these terms. So one thing that you might want to do if you're having a hard time articulating your value proposition is actually put it on paper and try to write a statement that really gets to what the benefits that your customer is getting from using your product or service, and then you can kind of get to what are the value attributes that you're trying to communicate and really start forming a definition of what the value proposition is. But again, going back to why this is so important, the value proposition is the center of the business model, and so if you can't understand the value proposition, it's really hard to understand what's going on with your company, and it's hard to make improvements or become more competitive if you don't really have an understanding on value proposition. So if you're going to put this on paper, one of the things that you might want to do is use these simple words again in terms of what we provide, how much we provide, what's the so what, what's the outcome for what we provide, and like show some evidence of that you are providing value. So that's really creating a strong written value proposition. So, it might be a good idea to kind of play with that, like pick a company or pick a service and really articulate what that value proposition is. And it could even be for, I don't know, you could pick a off-road vehicle or just some other product that might be a fun product that you have and try to articulate what the value proposition is for that product. And maybe what we'll do is I'll post some questions online that kind of relate to value proposition. So we talked about, in the beginning of the class, we talked about competitive advantage and core competencies. And so for you to really understand value proposition, the easiest way to start is with your core competencies. What are you good at? What do you do? And so the value proposition really comes out of what you do as a company and who you are as a company. The kind of catchphrase here is that sometimes companies create their value propositions on what they want to be, and they're not necessarily able to deliver all that value. But it's really hard to do that because you're going to create a disconnect. If you're trying to communicate value that you can't deliver, then customers are going to get wise to that, and you're going to alienate a lot of customers if you do that. So another angle that you might want to take in terms of from a competency standpoint is looking at some of the customer questions in terms of driving your value propositions. Who are your top customers? What are you doing with them? What problems are you solving? And then really taking a step back and saying, okay, well, yeah, we solve those problems, but what problems do our customers want solved? Make sure those things connect. Make sure those things are integrated, right? So this is, again, another just way to look and try to get and kind of pull out that kind of value proposition more explicitly. So by documenting and understanding your value proposition, it's going to help you a lot in terms of developing your strategy and making you be able to compete more effectively in your category. So really, what does a value proposition do? If you have a strong value proposition, it's going to connect with your target customer. And really, we're going to talk about later in this class that there's a lot of clutter and a lot of messaging that's happening and a lot of people trying to communicate value. But if we have a strong value proposition, we're going to be able to break through that clutter and we're going to get people's attention, right? So we'll talk about this a little bit later too, but what's happened is because of this clutter is people are, throwing dollars at marketing and advertising. But if you don't have a strong value proposition, if you throw so many dollars at marketing and advertising, it's not going to overcome that you have a crappy value proposition, right? So there's a lot of examples in the .com world in terms of when the .com crashed, that they tried to win customers by marketing and throwing money at advertising. So what was the thing that they used to say? They wanted to spend their way to profitability, and it didn't work. And so there's a lot of examples of failed companies that had a fairly weak value proposition that never resonated with customers. And so I guess a good example, and we might do a case on this later on, is pets.com. And so Pets.com was the pet retailer that delivered pet products online. It was one of the first online retailers. The problem was is the value proposition was broken because they couldn't capture the value in that it cost a lot of money to ship 50-pound bags of dog food, and people just weren't willing to pay for that. And so that they needed to have that element, and so they weren't really providing the value they said that they could do. A lot of the early grocery delivery companies had some of the same challenges. So again, be careful, but it's important that you have a strong value proposition for you to have a successful company and for you to create competitive advantage. You know, if you want to take a look at how this all fits together, really, this is a good chart that really captures what we're talking about from a business model and the 5 C's and different elements we talked about. And really, this chart really captures the entire marketing strategy process. So there's information and data that we need to know, and we really capture and can bucket this across our 5 C's. And so different elements we've talked about in terms of customer data, company data, competitor data, collaborator data, and the context of how it fits together. And really the elements that we're talking about in terms of market segments, target market, and then how do we position those products? Well, that's who we're going to deliver value to. And then how we communicate that value is through our marketing mix, which is the 4 Ps. And that's going to allow us kind of down to those bottom business elements to acquire our customers and retain those customers, and hopefully we can do that in a cost-effective way that generates profits. This is really kind of marketing strategy on one slide. Okay, so how does this all fit back to marketing and marketing strategy? So remember, the purpose of marketing is to reach consumers at the right moment and have the ability to influence their decisions. So how do we do that? Okay, so we're going to talk about that. And what we're going to really look at is how do we communicate value, that's positioning, and how we're going to reach the appropriate customer, and that's our segmentation strategy and our targeting strategy. And we're going to talk about how we're going to do that. So in upcoming classes, we're going to really talk about that. How does segmentation work, how does targeting work, and how does positioning work? And then we'll talk about how do we communicate that value to the customer. So one of the things that's important to understand in terms of developing your market strategy is understanding how consumers buy. And so there's different models that do this. And so this is really a purchase funnel. And so as consumers are looking for different benefits, you know, they have needs and wants, they're looking for different benefits that are going to meet and fulfill those. Consumers go through kind of this framework in terms of how that they evaluate and how they ultimately buy something. And you guys have probably seen different variants of this model. So first they need to understand that there's a need. They go out and look for something that could fulfill that need, look for the different alternatives. They make a decision, and then they're going to evaluate, does that purchase actually meet their needs? So along the way in marketing strategy through this funnel, what we are trying to do is communicate value or communicate our ability as a product, service, company, et cetera, and our ability to actually fulfill those needs. So we're trying to influence decision and behavior so that we are ultimately chosen to meet those particular needs of the consumer. So within that purchase funnel, one of the things that becomes a little more complicated, it's rarely just the consumer themselves that's influencing the buying process. And so this slide goes through different people that might be people that have influence in that decision, right? So this is an example of how this works for a family or a child that might want to go to Disneyland. So the child might ask his mom, hey, I want to go to Disneyland, right? And so the parent says, yeah, okay, that's fine. And then they might connect with a travel agent who's going to influence the behavior in terms of where they might stay, what they might do there, etc. The ultimate decider is the parents. The buyer might be the father itself, or could be the grandparent, etc. And then ultimately the user is the person that's reaping the benefits, was actually the child who was actually the initiator. So like you can see here, there's like 5 or 6 different people that could be involved and influence the buying process. So as a marketer, you need to understand that is who's influencing the buying process, and how do we and who do we communicate value to actually create that influence. Because what are we trying to do at the end of the day? We're trying to influence that behavior. So let's talk marketing managers just real quickly. And the question is really, what must marketing managers understand to engage in effective marketing practice, right? So we've talked about some of these things. So what are some of the things that you think that they might need to understand? Well, we know that we need to understand the 5 C's, right? So we need to understand how we provide value. We need to understand what our value proposition is. And then we have to understand and make decisions on how ultimately we're going to communicate value and deliver value to our customers. So there's different elements that we as marketing managers must understand. And it becomes fairly complicated. So, one main element that marketing managers really people think that they do, it's not all that they do, but they really need to deliver on the marketing mix. And the marketing mix has really 4 key elements. And these are just like breaking it down into different elements within it. So from product, place, price, and promotion. And I think you guys have been exposed to this. But we're going to talk about this in terms of how we can deliver and communicate value more effectively in the marketing mix. But these are all decisions that the marketing manager must make and must understand in order to deliver and communicate value and create competitive advantage for the company. So in an all-encompassing way to really talk about how we communicate value at the end of the day, we've talked about this as touch points. So just as a review, it's like having an understanding of what are the current touch points, what are the touch points that are working, what are they not, in terms of our ability to communicate value to a potential customer. And so you can look at this is just another framework that divides touch points into 3 different areas: the pre-purchase experience, the purchase experience, and post-purchase, and the different elements that might be timed according to that sequence. One of the things that's really hot right now in marketing is customer experience. So remember, it's not just the marketing, it's not just showing someone an advertisement that's going to create value or communicate value. It's every interaction that you have with a customer, every touch point you have is going to influence and have some impact on that customer. Some might not have impact as you want, it might not spur them to purchase, but every interaction has a influence, right? And that's positive and negative influences. That's why this customer experience and customer experience management is so hot right now, because we could delight the customer, we could get them in the door, but if we provide them a bad experience, that's going to only be a negative outcome for us. So we need to manage the entire customer experience. And how we do that is we do it through touch points and understanding all of the opportunities for our current and how do we integrate and match up all these touch points to provide that best experience for our customer. Okay, really this slide really talks about a lot of the things that we've talked about so far in terms of the overall marketing strategy process, and ultimately linking down to kind of that framework that we are centered on. It's segmentation, targeting, and positioning decisions. But in order to have those decisions or do those correctly or do those efficiently, there's different things that you need to know and different things that you need to put in context. So as we go forward in the class, we're really going to highlight some of the segmentation, targeting, and positioning topics and pull those out, and then give you some chances to look at how this really works in some of the cases that we do throughout the semester.